Start over for the live stream. We are learning Derech Mitzvosecha, Sefer of the Tzemach Tzedek, Third Rebbe of Chabad. We are learning Mitzvahs HaManos Alakus, his explanation of the commandment to have faith in God, whatever that may mean. We haven't really gone into it yet. Last week we started, before chapter 1, there is a whole introductory section, which we did last week. And the introductory section basically brings a bunch of different rabbinic opinions. How many were there? I think there were 4, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
About whether or not faith in God is a mitzvah, whether or not faith in God can be considered a commandment. This caused much controversy last week, but we came to understand that whether or not something is a mitzvah is a question of whether it counts among the 613 actual commandments that God made. Almost the way we've discussed it so far is as a technical matter, right? In other words, something can still be very important and an absolutely essential part of Torah. It's just not one of the 613 mitzvahs. So we had 2 camps. It was three against 1. We had the Rambam, Maimonides, we had the Ramban, Nachmanides, and we had the Zohar in 2 different places, if I'm not mistaken, that said that the faith in God is a mitzvah. And the faith in God, and where's the mitzvah written in the Torah? It's based on the first verse of the 10 Commandments. I am the Lord your God, who took you out from Egypt, from slavery and bondage in Egypt. So the dissenting opinion, which is brought by the Ramban, even though the Ramban disagrees with it, is the opinion of the Bahag, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, who lived in the times of the Gaonim. He's actually the oldest of the mentioned sources, except for the Zohar. So he's the second oldest of the mentioned sources, and he says that faith in God is not a mitzvah. It's not included among the 613 mitzvahs. He says faith in God is the root and foundation to all of the other mitzvahs, but it itself is not a commandment. And it's on this point that we're going to start today. I've made a mark. Hopefully I copied the right thing. Looks like I copied the right thing. Yeah, I made a mark at the end. You can see where I want to get to today. If we don't get there, or we get there too quickly, either way, it's not really a big deal. I thought that was a reasonable place to get to, because there's a lot of it's short inside, but there's a lot to discuss here. This is really, and that's probably what it's going to be like for most of these chapters. There's a little bit of text, but the little bit of text is going to be a whole lot of discussion. Yeah, because this is foundational stuff. So we are starting with the Bahag. We're starting with the dissenting opinion. Why does he say that emunah, that faith in God, is not a mitzvah? Okay. Vehine be'emes, Aleph, chapter 1 of the Tzemach Tzedek. This is the third Rebbe of Lubavitch, the Alter Rebbe's grandson. And he says, Vehine be'emes tzarich l'havin kushas bahag. In truth, we must understand the question of the Bahag. Now, the questions in Chassidic Maimarim, in Chassidic discourses, are always written in a way of tzarich l'havin, which is we need to understand. It never says the Bahag doesn't seem to make sense, or the Bahag is strange. The question in Chassidus always starts tzarich l'havin. We need to understand. In other words, the first step in Chassidus is to have this approach where obviously this is true. Even if the thing seems to contradict itself, the contradiction is true. Both sides are true. All we're trying to do is understand. We're not here to judge and say the Bahag does make sense or makes less sense or makes more sense. Compared to the Bahag, the Tzemach Tzedek would probably be the first to tell you, compared to the Bahag, we're nothing. We have no right. We have no place to make an opinion, to state our opinion on the Bahag.
No, but it makes sense. I mean, even if you wish to contradict, first you need to understand, then you can contradict.
Yeah, sure. That's also true. Fair enough. But the Chassidus starts in a position of tzarich l'havin. We need to understand. The problem is with us, not with the Bahag. The Bahag makes sense. We need to understand. What do we need to understand? His question. What's his question? As we said before, she'emunah b'mitziyusa yis'ala, that the faith in his existence, shua ikar v'asheresh eich yimnu b'cheshben hatzivuyim. That since faith is a root of all the mitzvahs, how can we count it in the count of the commandments? Again, since faith is the foundation of all the mitzvahs, how can it be counted among the commandments? That's what the Bahag asked. Now the question is, what does he mean? What does he mean by this idea that faith is, because faith is a foundation and because faith is a root of the mitzvahs, so we can't count it among the mitzvahs? What's this distinction? Maybe something could be both a foundation and a root and a mitzvah, right? Why is this? What's the problem here? V'kein hiksha harav Chizdai. This is the question of Harav Chizdai b'Sefer Or Hashem, in his book Or Hashem. We're going to meet new people. In fact, for the first few shiurim here, we're going to meet a lot of great rabbis, which is very nice. We read the words of a lot of great sages who maybe we don't meet so often. So Rav Chizdai was a Rishon. He lived after, or I think contemporary, maybe slightly after the Rambam. And Rav Chizdai's Or Hashem is a criticism of the Rambam and also all of the other Rishonim, all of the other Jewish rabbis who took the philosophical approach to Judaism. We are on page 15, the first page of the English. So Rav Chizdai was a rabbi who lived in the, if I'm not mistaken, during the time of the golden age of Spanish Jewry, during the Spanish Inquisition, just like someone else we're going to meet this evening, who's the Abarbanel, who's more famous. And Rav Chizdai, what was happening, right, you have to back up and say the history. The golden age of Spanish Jewry, which was right before the time of the Spanish Inquisition, which is part of why the Spanish Inquisition was such a tragedy, because the golden age of Spanish Jewry in Spain in the 1400s, immediately preceding the Inquisition, which was in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, was one of the, probably in the exile, since the destruction of the Second Temple, was probably one of the greatest, it's comparable to America, in terms of the freedom and the material wealth and the success of the Jewish community. It was probably the greatest since the destruction of the Second Temple. In Europe, certainly the greatest, and the Inquisition put an end to all of that. So before the Inquisition, there were many, many great rabbis who lived there. And basically what was happening in that time, which is actually an interesting parallel to what's happening in our time here in America, in everything's less serious now. So it's actually, whatever, it's a whole other discussion. But in some ways similar, there are some parallels to what happened during the Spanish Inquisition, because basically what was happening is that because of Muslim philosophers and Christian philosophers in the Middle Ages, Aristotelian philosophy, which were the rediscovered classics or the revived classics, was very much in vogue. So basically, Greek philosophy, the old Greek philosophy, was very popular in the late Middle Ages. And what was happening is that beliefs that Jews had always had, which had never yet really been challenged, were meeting challenge in were being challenged by philosophy in a very modern context. And philosophy says things that from the Torah are not clear at all. For example, the Rambam writes, this is very interesting. So we're going to go on a digression. Hopefully we'll have time. I don't know if we're going to get to where we need to get to, but that's okay because this is important stuff. The Rambam writes in Mishnah Torah, in his book of Jewish law, that anybody that believes that God has a body or the form of a body is a heretic.
Is what?
A heretic, apikoros, kofer. You don't have anybody that believes that God has a body or the form of a body is a heretic. Now the Rambam is always printed. If you read the Rambam with any commentaries at all, he's printed with the Ravid, Rav Avram, who would argue on the Rambam, right? That's the old joke: is why does the Rosh Hashiva believe that God exists? Because the Rambam says he exists, and the Ravid doesn't argue. That's the famous joke. So there's the Rambam and the Ravid. So the Rambam says that anyone who says that God has a body or the form of a body is a heretic. The Ravid comments and says, how can the Rambam say this? There were many who were far greater than he who believed such things. And what's the Ravid referring to? The Ravid is referring to the idea that really before the Middle Ages, what the Torah said, and the way Jewish belief always was that what the Torah says is absolute truth and wasn't really questioned. In other words, the great sages, even of the Talmud and of the Mishnah, who were unbelievable intellects, as we see from the way that the Talmud works and the way the Mishnah works and the way we learn it, they weren't necessarily interested at all. In fact, they may have even felt it was prohibited, as there's much evidence to attest to that in some Mishnayos. They may have felt it was prohibited to pry into the nature of God or the nature of godliness in any way at all. Metaphysics was not a Jewish pursuit at all. In ancient times in the Talmud, there are things, the Talmud says this, the Talmud says that, but clearly the nature of those things is more personal experience, prophecy. Their teacher taught them. It came from Torah. It came from Moshe at Mount Sinai. The sort of studying metaphysics as a philosophy was not really, aside from the Kabbalists and aside from the Zohar, and that received wisdom, which was very, very select few of the Jewish people, very few people studied those things. So the Ravid said on the Rambam, how can you say that anyone who believes that God has a body is a heretic? there are probably sages of the Talmud who believe that God had a body, and not because they'd really thought about it or looked into it, but specifically because who needs to think about it? The Torah says God took the Jewish people out of Egypt with a strong arm and an outstretched hand, right? And if the Torah says it, it must be true. Why think about it, right? The Jews' role in life was to live according to Torah. It just never occurred to many people. One assumes, or it was never a problem to think that there's something wrong with this. Then fast forward to the late Middle Ages, which is what we're talking about now. And many Jews, upon encountering philosophy, which obviously the classical philosophy says that whole idea is completely preposterous, right? The idea that God has a body and God has this and God has that, and it proves very thoroughly, or attempts to prove very thoroughly, why that's not the case. And many Jews thought that this was in contradiction to Judaism, and they started leaving Judaism in droves. So,
it's written not Bezronica, but about Moses. Because Moses wanted to see his face, and said, "No, you cannot see my face."
Sure, there's probably dozens of times in the Torah where there's some sort of implied anthropomorphism of God, right? Mm-hmm. So the Rambam, and people like the Rambam, Maimonides, in the Middle Ages, and they wrote a series of philosophical works. Rav Sajagon wrote one, Rav Yehuda Halevi wrote the Kuzari, the Rambam wrote Mor Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. There's this whole series of Torah literature from the Middle Ages, which were basically rabbis, mostly from the Sephardic world, because that's where they had this issue, explaining why Torah was correct, basically in apologetics literature, why Torah is correct according to even these principles. You can have a deep philosophical understanding of the world, and the Torah is not in contradiction to that at all. And that's what all of these rabbis were out to prove with their philosophical works. Came along Rav Chizdai immediately after them, that's what started this whole digression, and he basically wrote a book called Or Hashem, arguing with all of them and saying that although demonstrating how philosophy and Judaism can go together is a positive thing, because you're trying to rescue Judaism in the minds of people who philosophy is, so to speak, turning off from the religion. Rav Chizdai wrote that it's very dangerous to say that the basis of Judaism is philosophical belief or Greek philosophy or Aristotelianism. So Rav Chizdai was the reaction, so to speak. Rav Chizdai came and said, he wrote a whole book about how all of those proofs are fallacious. You don't need them. The whole philosophy thing has massive problems from the start. Many things the Rambam writes are wrong philosophically. So are basically arguing with all of these philosophers. So this Rav Chizdai, that whole thing was just a biological note on Rav Chizdai. Okay, Rav Chizdai is brought in Rav Yitzchak Abarbanel's Sefer. Rav Yitzchak Abarbanel was one of the last rabbis of the Spanish Enlightenment. In fact, he was an advisor in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, and he actually tried to pay off the king and queen with his vast personal fortune to stop the Spanish Inquisition, but Torquemada basically overruled him and began the Inquisition anyway. He was extremely influential in the court of the Spanish king and queen, and he also happens to be one of the absolute giants of Torah study. And in that time, the two things were not in any way a contradiction. Nowadays, maybe it seems a little odd to us, but that was what was happening during the golden age of Spanish Jewry, is that you had an unbelievable giant of Torah, an incredibly righteous man, a tzaddik, who wrote a commentary on the Torah, who was also, as his day job, an advisor to the Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain.
And that was?
Abarbanel, Don Yitzchak Abarbanel. Yeah. So Abarbanel brings Rav Chizdai, and Rav Chizdai says as follows, okay? We're on the question of why the Bahag says, remember from last week, why the Bahag says that emunah cannot be a mitzvah, right? We said the Bahag says it's a foundation to all the commandments, but it itself is not a commandment. And the question is why? What's the contradiction? Why can't it be a foundation and a commandment in and of itself? Why are the two in contradiction? Rav Chizdai says as follows: Sheta tos gemura mishen mana anecheva elokecha mitzvah. Someone is making a great error if they count "I am the Lord your God" as a mitzvah, as one of the 613 commandments, to have faith in God. Lefisha mitzvah himina mitztaref, because a mitzvah is only a secondary attribute of your relationship with God. A mitzvah is in some sense a consequence of a relationship with God, right? In the very simple understanding, if someone commands you to do something, the existence of the commander is presupposed, right? I can't come to you and command to you, believe in me, believe that I exist. If you listen to me, so that means who are you listening to? I already exist, right? And if you don't listen, so how can there be a commandment to believe that I exist, right? It's a logical problem. How can you count this as a mitzvah? The mitzvah comes second. The existence of God comes first. God's commandment comes second. How can you believe that God commands you to do something without believing that God exists? So in other words, what Rav Chisda is saying is that the commandment to believe in God is in some sense, logical contradiction, or it's a confusion. How can there be a command, thou shalt believe in me, the one speaking these words? Believe that I exist. Right? That's very strange. If you're listening, then obviously I exist. Right? It's a preface.
It would be a coercion.
It's just meaningless. What's the command? If you're listening to the command, then you're already if you can even hear me saying the words, you're already following it, right? There's no gap there. It's almost like a tautology.
The mitzvah is not to believe in Hashem. The mitzvah is to believe that Hashem, that you do believe him, is the one that took you out of Egypt.
That's the whole subject. I mean, it's like that's what we're talking about.
One second, we'll get to what the mitzvah is. So Rav Chisda is saying that someone can't command you, believe in me, the one who's giving you this commandment. That's not a logical commandment. You cannot have this mitzvah, you cannot have this commandment unless you already have a known God, because otherwise who is giving you the commandment? So in other words, there is no non-fulfilling this commandment. If the commandment is given and you believe it is a commandment, then you are already fulfilling the commandment, right? There's no gap here between the commandment is given to you and then you have a choice whether or not to do it. The commandment is given, and if you believe in the commandment, if you believe that God is commanding you to believe in him, then you already believe in him. You understand? It's a bit of a word salad, as we'll see here.
Yeah, the English and the Hebrew, I mean, they're not even correlated. It's amazing.
You can complain to Rabbi Tauger. I know him personally. Therefore, when a person says that the faith in God's existence is a mitzvah, you have already decided that God exists before you get to the commandment of whether God exists. If you believe that there is a commandment to believe in God, implicit in the idea that there is a commandment is that you already believe in God, right? The idea is clear? And he says, all of this is completely empty and embarrassing, that a person should even think that it's a mitzvah. So Rav Chisda was not sparing in his commentary on the Rambam. He says this is empty and embarrassing if a person thinks that this is a mitzvah, because it's clearly a contradiction. How can you have a mitzvah to believe in the one that is giving you the mitzvah? Amnam, however, the Tzemach Tzedek is now saying, HaChacham HaGadol HaShalim B'dei Esav, the great Chacham, the great sage, perfect in his wisdom, Harav Yitzchak Abar Benel, the Abar Benel, Hichzik Das HaRambam, he defends the Rambam against Rav Chisda. Befrat kikenu das harayim hemna, especially because this is the opinion of the Zohar. In other words, he's saying that the Abar Benel was a Kabbalist, and he knew that the Zohar, which is the inner aspect of Torah, the deepest reaches of Torah, says that faith in God is a mitzvah, and therefore this is why he decided to defend the Rambam, because if the Zohar says it, it must be true. And Emunah is a mitzvah. So what do you do with this claim of Rav Chisda now? Rav Chisda says, how can you have it doesn't even make sense that you can have a commandment to believe in the one who's giving you the commandment. So he says, the Abar Benel's answer is as follows. Brilliant answer. Oh, sorry. It must be true because it is the Torah's Moshe, the Rai Mehemna. It's like whatever. The Zohar. He was certain that what the Zohar said must be correct. That faith in God is a mitzvah. So how does he defend the Rambam? Therefore, he answers in chapter 7 as follows. That the Rambam's intent was not as Rav Chisda understood. Bepirush Mitzvosecha Emunas Matzias Akel Reitzelomer Shehu Nimtza Bilvad, which is basically what Ronnie was saying. That the mitzvah is not what the Rambam says when he says there's a mitzvah to believe in God is not the mitzvah simply that God exists. Asher Soisrehu Anedar Chas v'Shalom, the contradiction of his non-existence. God forbid he shouldn't exist. Is what he's saying. Again, the Abar Benel, what?
Chas v'shalom. The English is God forbid.
Yeah. Again, what's happening here? The Abarbanel is defending the idea that faith in God is a mitzvah. And he's defending it as follows. The logical contradiction that Rav Chizdai saw, that you can't be commanded to believe in the person giving you the commandment. That logical contradiction only holds if the commandment is believe that I exist. In other words, the simple statement that I am here as opposed to not here, right? He says, Soisrehu anedar, in contradiction of non-existence, in contradiction of a lack. The Rambam is not just coming and saying that there's a mitzvah to believe in God, there's a mitzvah to know that God exists, meaning there is something called a God as opposed to there is not a thing called God. The mitzvah of faith, the commandment of faith, according to the Rambam, is not simply that there is a God, with nothing else said about him. Because that would be a contradiction, like Rav Chizdai is saying. How can you be commanded to believe in the one that's giving you the commandment? That doesn't make sense. But if you read it well and you read it correctly, you'll see that that's not what the Rambam is saying. Rather, what does the Abarbanel say? Rather, the intention of the great rabbi, meaning the Rambam, in all of his words, is that the first principle and the first mitzvah, is to believe that God, may he be blessed, that whom we already know exists, that his existence is the first and most complete of all existences. Again, if I am God coming to the Jewish people, I am not commanding, according to the Rambam, the way the Abarbanel is explaining the Rambam, I am not coming to the Jewish people and telling them, believe that I exist. That's ridiculous. If you see me before, if you're listening to my words, that already means that you believe that I exist, right? There can't be a commandment for that. What I would be coming and saying to the Jewish people is, I am the first and most perfect of all existences. Not that I exist. That I exist, if you're listening to me, you already think that. The commandment is, believe that I am the first and highest, I am the first and most perfect of all existences. That his existence is not possible, is not itself possible like the other existences, but rather his existence is a necessary existence, right? This is the classic philosophical definition of God, of what God is, what the word God means. The word God means is an existence who does not need anything else to exist. He exists. This is what they call a necessary existence, not a possible existence. His existence does not depend in any sense on anything else. It is an existence in and of itself.
It's actually similar to the Or and Sof. It's not only Or, it's Or and Sof. It's like, something that
it's still,
cannot even describe.
But it's Or and Sof. It's less than essence. Never mind. It's lo shayach.
So the question, as it's phrased in Chassidus, is why it's called Or Ein Sof and not Or Ein Tchila. Right? The answer is because it has a Tchila. It's Or. It's not God Himself. It's only the light of God. It's a whole discussion. That's not really what we're talking about here. We're saying here God Himself. We're not getting into Kabbalistic levels yet. Don't be disappointed. Don't be discouraged. For our Sfardim, we will have more Kabbalah. We will have more Kabbalah later. But we're simply saying God Himself, in a simple understanding. When you say the word God, what do you mean? It's kind of important. People don't think about this. God is just the simple understanding. The simple belief of a child, which is very important and very holy. But the actual definition of the word is an existence who does not need anything else to exist. Everything else needs something to exist. God doesn't need anything to exist.
In order to exist.
Yeah, it doesn't need anything else to exist. It's for Himself to exist. Yeah, I should have been clear. Everything else needs Him, and He does not need anything else.
There's no chemistry.
No. The fact that the way it works, and the way it works in the classic philosophical svarim, the way it would work in the Moreh Nevuchim and many others, not even necessarily just limited to Judaism, the way it's explained lahavdil, in all of the different books, the way it's explained in all of the different books is that there's a progression, right? You start with the question, right? Why does God exist? How do we know that God exists? Because we need to talk about this, because this is what we're going to talk. There's a difference between knowing and believing. Does anyone have the time? I need to watch, please. 8:34. 8:34? Perfect. You start with the question of how do you know that God exists? It's important. You know that. Thank you very much. You know that. This is I feel like I'm at the Watchtower. We know. I don't know why the Facebook Live broadcast doesn't allow them to have a little clock in the corner. It's very, very. I have a bone to pick with Facebook.
Someone is hearing you now.
Okay. You start with the question of how do you know that God exists? The answer to how do you know that God exists is very, very, very simple. In fact, it's far, far, far more simple than you would ever come to believe, given the controversy that is behind the matter, right? The classical explanation for why God exists is that there are some things that have begun to exist. There are some things that are limited. Those limited things need to have. Because they're limited, that means they began either temporally or qualitatively. They began at some point. They have not been always, in any sense of the word, either qualitatively or in time. They need something to cause them. They themselves need a cause, and then the cause that caused them, if it is limited and it has a beginning, it needs a cause, and that goes all the way back until you basically reach the need to have a cause who is uncaused. You have to have an uncaused cause. You have to have something that has nothing before it himself. And then the way the Rambam does it is the Rambam talks about how that's clearly the case. And then once you have that existence, who is the first of all existences, the Rambam goes through the work of explaining how, pardon me, if he's uncaused, that means that he doesn't have parts. It's all explained. It's all according to logic. If he's uncaused, he doesn't have parts, and he doesn't have a body, and he's not divided in this way, and he can't be described by words. And there's all these different things that come out as a consequence of him being the uncaused cause. So in other words, what we're saying when we say that God is a necessary existence, and this is what the commandment of faith is. According to the Abarbanel's explanation, the commandment of faith is not just to believe that God exists; it is to believe in his nature, for lack of a better term. It's probably the wrong term, but to believe in what God is, the true nature of God, which is the mechuyev hametzias, the necessary existence, the first cause of everything that he himself does not need a cause. Kfar hisbayer sham mechuyev. It has already been explained. The Abarbanel says that he is necessary, for he doesn't need anything else outside of him. That's what necessary. That's what it means that he's necessary. As opposed to everything that is not God needs God to exist. Since he gives the existence, he grants existence, and they translate continuity, which is interesting. Existence and continuity to all of the creations. So to sum up, the Rambam says faith in God is a mitzvah. Rav Chizdoi, this is why the Bahag says it's not a mitzvah. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek is saying. He's saying the Bahag asks, and Rav Chizdoi gives us the words to understand what the Bahag is asking, is how can you have a commandment to believe the one that is giving you the commandment, believe that he exists? And the answer is that the commandment's not to believe that he exists. That he exists, everyone agrees, is not a commandment. That's what the Bahag was talking about. When he said faith in God is not a commandment, he meant, it would seem, at least up until this point of what we're talking about, it would seem that what he meant was the fact that God exists. That cannot be a commandment, and is merely a foundational principle of Torah, a foundational principle of Jewish belief. The idea is simply that God exists. What the commandment is, according to the Rambam, as the Abarbanel explains, is the commandment to believe that God is the first and highest of all existences, that he is a necessary existence, and everything else is dependent on God, whereas God is dependent on nothing else. And that's the commandment of faith, which is a very philosophical way of saying what the commandment of faith is. Interesting.
Is that the only commandment of faith?
What do you?
That seems to be the primary commandment which does not imply or require human action?
And what other commandments would there be? Like secondary?
Everything else is do this, don't do this, don't do
Right. That's very good because you're remembering from last week we used that as a distinguisher. But the fact is that the question on that is there's not very many, but there are a few. There are a few in Torah. First of all, we mentioned last week that there's belief in God. There's also the unity of God, which is a separate mitzvah, which we haven't gotten into what that is. What's a separate mitzvah? Then you have love of God, fear of God, love of your fellow man. Right? Now there are some halachic interpretations which say that all of these things are not commandments on feelings or beliefs. They're all commandments on action. Right? So there's different ways of looking at it, right? If I'm not mistaken, I probably shouldn't say it because I don't know. Okay. I don't know if it's the only one, but there's not very many, that's for sure. There's not very many commandments that don't require a specified action. Va'ila midvarov. So what comes out, the Tzemach Tzedek says now, what comes out from the words of the Abarbanel, what we learn here, that faith is not about when we say faith, when Judaism says there's a mitzvah to have faith is not the belief that God exists. For this we do not need a commandment. Because we already know that he exists, as we will explain further later. Okay. The commandment is on the faith that his existence is the most perfect or the most complete of all existences. Okay, so that's, until here, you have we basically have not really said anything from the Tzemach Tzedek himself. We haven't even really started Chassidus until here. We're explaining what all of these different opinions say, and we're explaining how the Abarbanel shows that faith, what we know is that the commandment of faith is not on faith in the simple existence of God, but rather that he is the most perfect of all existences. But that is a very philosophical explanation. In fact, if you speak to anyone who is not steeped in philosophical thought, they would say that's a very strange notion. The idea that, what does it mean when God says on Mount Sinai, I am the Lord your God? It means to know that he is necessary existence and everything else depends on him, but he depends on nothing else.
Does it make a difference? It doesn't make a difference.
It sounds very philosophical, right? Yeah. So the Kabbalah, so now we're going to say what the Kabbalah says. The Kabbalah has it's very exciting. The Kabbalah has this isn't even what I was thinking of when I said there's Kabbalah coming. The Kabbalah says differently. There's something else that's the true faith in God. And we're going to get into the differences between these opinions, okay? In al pi derech Kabbalah, the Tzemach Tzedek says, the Rebbe says, according to the way of Kabbalah, hu be'inyan acher, kamasha yisbar lefanenu im yirtza Hashem. It's a different, faith is something else. It's not the belief that God is a necessary existence. That's something else. As we're going to, and what Kabbalah actually says faith is, we're going to explain, not yet. So what we're going to explain really for the rest of tonight's class is why does Kabbalah not accept a philosophical explanation? In other words, why do we need something further? Why does Kabbalah say something different than philosophical explanation? The philosophical explanation of what the commandment to believe in God is the explanation that he is the most perfect and necessary, and he is the necessary existence. Kabbalah disagrees. And for the rest of tonight, we're going to talk about why does Kabbalah disagree? Why is this not sufficient? Okay, and we're going to say it right here. Because in the opinion of the Kabbalah, even God being a necessary existence is not something that demands faith. On the contrary, this is included within knowledge of God, rather than faith in God. And this is the first time we're making that meaningful. Yeah. This is the first time we're making that distinction, which I also mentioned last week. We're going to be talking about the difference between knowledge and faith. So Tzemach Tzedek is saying that, in other words, what it's going to be a question of in the end, and let me preface, is that it's going to be a question in the end of where you draw the line, right? Where do you draw the line? What can you know? And what do you have to, let's say for the moment that faith means just believe. The English words are very insufficient and they have too many connotations. They're all caught up in a bunch of things that are not applicable at all. So I use them very tentatively. But let's just say, for the purposes of simplicity, that it's going to be a question of drawing the line between what you can know and what you believe about God. The Abarbanel says that what we know, or at least it's interesting because it's what we need to know for the purposes of a mitzvah to make sense, right, as we've been explaining. For the idea of a commandment to even make sense, you have to have a foreknowledge that at least that God exists, as we've been explaining, right? That's what Rav Chisdai said. Faith is really in the definition of God. What is this thing that we know exists? It is the first existence who is the most perfect and the necessary existence and doesn't need anything else to exist.
Well, faith is above knowledge.
Yeah, well, that's what we're assuming. We haven't even defined faith yet, which is interesting. So instead, it's just going.
If you know, you don't need faith.
We're going to talk about what emunah even means, what faith means, but. Yeah, in the basic understanding, yes. If you know, you don't need faith. So it's a question of where you draw the line. What can you know, and what do you just have to believe? So the Abarbanel says that what you have to know, at least for the commandment to make sense, is that God exists. What you believe is the nature of God, or what God is by definition, right? Kabbalah draws the line somewhere else. Kabbalah says you can know way more than what the Abarbanel allowed for. Kabbalah is saying that the fact that he is the most necessary existence is also not something that you need faith for. That's not a commandment of faith. That might fall under the commandment of to know God. But the commandment of having faith in God, it does not include the idea that God is a necessary existence. On the contrary, as I just explained to you very briefly, it's a philosophical conclusion, right? It's something that you know about God, right? If there is a God, and what we're calling God in the sense of He is He is the one that brings the world about, and everything needs a cause, and you arrive at something which it itself does not need a cause, then clearly that is a philosophical investigation. You look at the world, you look at what things are, and you come to a logical conclusion that there must be a God. Not only that there must be a God, but that what am I looking for? What's the only thing that answers that question, this gap in my knowledge? This cause that we need is something which it itself doesn't need a cause. So you see that it's a philosophical conclusion. It's something you can know. It's what you can come to that conclusion quite logically about God. You don't need faith for that. You don't need to be told that. You don't need this belief or this super rational, whatever you want to call it.
But this is even something that makes it even double harder. First, you don't even know what God is, but you need to believe in God.
Who said what He is?
No, well, we believe in God. I mean, believe God is God. We don't really know to explain.
No, it doesn't say what it is.
No. But now, not only that we don't know what it is, but we also need to believe that it doesn't need any reason to exist. Why do we even need to guess it?
On the contrary, that's what we're saying. We're saying that in the Kabbalistic worldview, all of that is, so to speak, a given. All of that makes sense. People don't know this when they learn Chassidus. It's very interesting that the existence of God, as the question is phrased nowadays, is viewed in the eyes of Chassidus and Kabbalah as a prerequisite. It's not something Chassidus and Kabbalah even deals. It's not even on the table. This is part of the simple knowledge of the world.
Right,
this is the logical.
It's fact.
There is a God, but what do you mean when you say there is a God? You mean very simply. This is what the Rambam says in Halacha, that you have to know that there's something which caused the world, which it itself doesn't have a cause. There's an existence.
But why do we need even to assume it? Why does it make a difference for us?
If you want to understand the world, it makes a difference. That's what I was saying at the beginning, that there are many Jews before the Rambam and very great rabbis who weren't concerned with this question at all. And that's fine. You don't have to necessarily be concerned with the question, right? Unless God commands you that you have to know about this or you have to have faith in
because
this.
It's like, you have a formula with too many arguments, which none of them is known to you. Not only that you don't know God, but now you start wondering, okay, I don't know it, but it doesn't need anything to make it exist. It exists by itself. So it makes it, more complicated.
It's like saying that I've never sat and ate spaghetti with the Pythagorean theorem. So I'm just not going there. It's not, you can just not go there, and that option is open to you. And there are many great Jews who didn't go there, and they believed with the simple faith of children, which is very highly valued in Judaism. But the fact remains that it's the Pythagorean theorem. It's not made up. Go and do the math and see what a triangle is and see what a hypotenuse is, and you'll see that the theorem is correct. It's the math. It's proven. There's a whole thing.
I'm going to give you an example. Do you see this ball in front of us? Actually, I don't see the ball, but no, believe there is a ball. This ball that you don't see is actually red.
But what I'm saying is, that's very good. That's good what you're saying. But what I'm saying is that that's based on a false assumption. It's based on the false assumption that God is a thing, like the bowl is a thing. God is not a thing like the bowl is. In fact, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this form of knowing that there is a God in terms of the first cause is more like something in math than it is like a bowl. I'm not saying that there's a thing called God which looks like something and has certain characteristics that is somewhere and you've never seen it, and we must just talk about it and describe it like an object that we've never seen. What I'm saying is that if a person looks at the world and they try and figure out how logically it's possible that the world can be here, and this is what philosophers from many different religions, many different times have come to the conclusion that there must be a first cause. There must be something which it itself does not need to cause, which causes everything else. And that conclusion that you reach is much more like a mathematical conclusion than just talking about an object that's not here. It's something that, because in your mind you go through the steps and you realize that there must be something, so it's a much more firm and relatable and solid thing, like a mathematical proof. Much more, it's what's called demonstrative logic. It's not like looking for evidence at a crime scene. It's like proving a theorem in mathematics. It's two different types of thinking. You understand what I'm saying? We're not looking for God's footprints. We're saying if you start with these first principles and you use logic, you will come to the following conclusion. It's a different way of thinking. It's very philosophical. That's the philosophical way of thinking about God. That's how it works.
Because you take an assumption and take that assumption. So, okay, this is an assumption, and this is it. Well, it's kind of.
This is not. I mean, no, because this isn't really a philosophy class. We could get into it, but that's okay. We don't have much further to go. Okay, so Kabbalah says that we can talk about philosophy some other time. It's very interesting. Kabbalah says that even him being the perfect existence is a philosophical conclusion. It's something you can know. It's not something you have to believe in. Because it's included in the knowledge that we have a God who gives life to the world. When we say he gives life to the world, the implication in Chassidus normally is that he doesn't just create it initially, but rather he creates it at every second, which is also he maintains the world in existence to some extent, is invested in the world. There's different meanings of the word gives life. But the bottom line is that he's a God who's involved, one way or another, who's involved in the world creation, which is also another one of the philosophical corollaries that the Rambam would talk about, for example, that once you realize that there's this first existence that the world needs, who he himself does not need the world, and he doesn't have a cause, you will come eventually to the conclusion, the Rambam argues through logic, that not only does the world need him to initially create it, but it needs him constantly to create it. And now it doesn't just need him to create it initially, but every moment the world needs God to exist. One second. Let me just try and let's try and get to where we need to go, and then afterwards we can maybe have a moment or two for questions. At this point, so we have a God who creates the world. He must certainly be that necessary existence. As the Abar Benel himself defines mechuyev hametzias. He's necessary. There must be this existence which is necessary, which does not require the world. So rather, what is faith? So Kabbalah says that we draw the line elsewhere, because what the philosophical approach says you need to take on faith, Kabbalah argues is actually not a faith thing, because you can know that. So why even call it faith? Just say it's the mitzvah of knowing God. If you're calling it the mitzvah of faith, which we do, that is our intention, we want to know what it means when it says you must, when all these rabbis say you must believe in God, the Kabbalistic understanding of what that means is the faith that he is exalted and removed high above the level of chachma, the level of intellect, the level of understanding. God exists beyond what we are able to comprehend. Right? In other words, in direct contradiction to the philosophical understanding. The philosophical understanding of faith is there is a God, I understand what role he plays in the world, he is the uncaused cause, and I sort of know what he is to some extent, right? That's what God is. He's the uncaused cause. Kabbalah says that's not faith, that's knowledge, you know, right? Faith is that there is a God beyond what you can know. There's a God beyond what is definable. That's what faith is according to Kabbalah. Nedarim mitzvahs tav vav. as the Tzemach Tzedek explained in a different mitzvah, Derech Mitzvosecha, the mitzvah of vows. Okay, so the rest is a parentheses. Okay, Eyal, what's the question?
But the thing is, I'm sure you know Rabbi Yossi Jacobson.
Yeah.
So he's putting a very simple example.
Yeah.
He's saying, one day Steve walks into someplace in Colorado, all of a sudden say, wow, my name, Steve, is written on a mountain.
Yeah.
Then he continues to say, okay, well, maybe it was an avalanche or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, let's continue. Yeah. Then he continues to say, oh, good morning, Steve.
Yeah.
Wait a second. It's like, it gets farther and farther.
Yeah.
So obviously, there are some facts that, we look at the DNA of the structure of the human being and any other structure in this universe, and almost like facts, and you see the logic behind it. We lately understand that what's in there. So why do we need to make it so complicated to believe in the existence of God without really understanding what God really means?
There's so much. It's such a loaded question. There's so much to say to that question. Yeah, sorry. What were you saying, Spencer?
God exceeds existential knowledge. Knowledge of God exceeds existential knowledge. Existential knowledge is what we have here around us.
Like I see something and I know it's there. Yeah.
It exceeds existential knowledge. It's a different kind of knowledge.
Yeah. And I gave mathematics as an example because demonstrative proof, mathematically speaking, is very similar to a logical proof for God's existence. But the truth is, there's a lot to talk about in your question because there's a lot to say. There's a lot of issues to address there. The one thing I'll say now is that it's not so different. It's not so different. It's the same sort of thing. The argument that you make there, which is a different sort of argument that things can't have happened by accident, so you need a God for them, is essentially the same argument. It's essentially the same thing. There's different. Coming from a different angle, rather than talking about how a caused thing needs to have a cause that comes before it, right? Which is a very philosophical way of phrasing it. You can say that a thing which has meaning, or a thing that seems to have a purpose, needs something that comes before it to grant it purpose, right? And it becomes the same argument. So what grants the thing that comes before it purpose? And what grants that purpose? And eventually, you reach something which is purpose in and of itself. Right, this is what's called the teleological argument in English, right? That a thing that there's a chain that there must be something which is in and of itself. It needs no reason and there is no explanation of it. It just is. That's God. It's the same. It really is. If you bear down to the bare bones of it, it's the same thing. There's a much more relatable and understandable way of explaining what I'm saying. It doesn't have to be used in the philosophical language. What I'm saying is that in the bare bones, it's very similar. It's very similar. It's a similar type of argument. Most philosophical arguments for God are really reflections of the same foundational idea. Okay, so let's do the parentheses very quickly. We have 5 minutes. The problem is that the parentheses could really deserve a week, but we're going to give it 5 minutes here. This is a good parentheses. Included in this, that God vivifies the world. Included in this idea, in other words, seemingly included in this idea of what we can know and what we do not need faith for, is the idea that the world is nullified to God in the words of his mouth, right? The Tzemach Tzedek is citing the work of his grandfather. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya, in the philosophical part of Tanya, the second book of the 5 books of the Tanya, called Shari Yichud Ve'emunah, explains, he starts where the Rambam leaves off, right? The Rambam says you need a God to create the world, and number 2, you need a God to create the world constantly at every moment. And what the Alter Rebbe endeavors, remember we learned this together, what the Alter Rebbe endeavors to demonstrate there, not just from the verses, which he also does, but also logically, is that if you really believe that the world is created something from nothing by God at every moment, which really is what the Rambam is saying, which really is a philosophical conclusion, if you follow all of the earlier philosophy, then, therefore, this is what the Rambam is explaining in the first few chapters of Shari Yichud Ve'emunah, therefore, what you must conclude is that the world has no independent existence from God whatsoever. The world is completely nullified to the expression of God. In other words, the world exists. The world as an entity unto itself does not exist. The world exists only in as much as it's an expression of God. So everything in the world is
inside of God.
not just inside of God. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. It's very complicated. Very complicated. Very complicated. But it's very deep. It's very deep, and it goes to many levels. The Alter Rebbe, it's successive. The Alter Rebbe explains how, and you might think that there's this aspect of the world which is not totally an expression of God. And the Alter Rebbe basically goes through step by step and explains how this is the most unified philosophical unity of things that cannot be separated in any way whatsoever. That the world is only an expression of godliness. It has no independent existence whatsoever, which is the philosophical foundation of all of Chassidus. That's the philosophical foundation of everything that we learn in Chassidus, that the world has no independent existence, independent reality from God. So the Tzemach Tzedek is saying here that this idea seems to be a further logical conclusion. This seems to be something you can know, not something you need to have faith for. Kabitul Or HaShemesh B'Shemesh, that the world is nullified to God like the light of the sun within the sun, which you can go read in Tanya at length. Okay, and as is explained in Tzemach Tzedek's Maimar on Matzah. Okay, that idea really does not fall under the idea, wouldn't fall under the idea of faith in God in any case. It falls under the idea of that's about the unity of God. This is more an idea of has to do with the unity of God rather than faith in God himself. Faith in God is about what God is and to the extent to which he is basically the extent of God and the extent to which he's removed from us and exalted, right? The faith, as we said before, faith in God as he transcends intellect is the Kabbalistic understanding of faith. The idea that the world is nothing to God is a different idea. That's the unity of God. Okay? And it seems that we have to explain it that way because on the surface there's a problem. That seemingly in the concept of unity, we don't need a commandment for the concept of unity at all, because it seems so logically necessary. If you follow all the logical steps, you come to this idea that the world is totally united with God. So why do you need a mitzvah? What's the commandment of God's unity? And therefore Rav Chizdai would say that we should not count the unity of God as a mitzvah, as Rav Chizdai indeed says, like he says about faith. So rather, the mitzvah of faith is about his transcendence. In other words, we just had a parenthetical statement. The parenthetical statement summarized says that seemingly the idea of the world being totally nullified nullified to godliness and nullified before God's existence is a further logical conclusion of the principles that we're discussing. And he's basically saying that it's true, and it seems that would imply that you can't have a mitzvah on unity, just like Rav Chizdai says you can't have a mitzvah on faith, so too you can't have a mitzvah on unity because it's something that's known, right? It's something that you simply grasp as an extension of your knowledge. It's a logical conclusion following from the initial principles. So why would you have a commandment for it? And basically we leave that as a question. Here we're not talking about that. We're only talking about the idea that there is a God who is beyond our knowledge and understanding. So in summary of today's lesson, because we're stopping in the middle of a chapter, the summary is we explained, number one, why you can't have a mitzvah just to believe in the simple existence of God, because there's a certain logical contradiction there. I can't command you to believe that I exist. We explained that the Rambam's real intention is not the simple idea that God exists, but rather the nature of God, that he is the first and most perfect of all existences. Then we explained that really, according to Kabbalah, that's not something you need faith for, that's something you can know. And the Kabbalistic idea of faith is faith in a God who transcends knowledge, who transcends what can be known by the intellect. And we're going to talk more about that idea next week.
Oh yeah.
Very much. Why does it really make such a big difference?